Many of the security crises we talk about today do not begin with violence. They begin much earlier, with failed harvests, rising food prices, shrinking livelihoods, and institutions that respond too late or speak too vaguely. Long before a situation is labeled as insecurity, pressure has already been building up quietly in everyday life. In this episode of the Delimi PROSPER Podcast, we focus on that long, often invisible build-up, where climate stress, economic strain, and weak policy communication intersect to produce instability. This is a conversation about systems, not slogans, about prevention, not reaction. My guest is Abdulhaleem Ishaq Ringim, an economist and public policy advisor working inside government at the intersection of economic reform, resilience planning, and emergency response. Drawing on institutional experience and lived understanding, he helps us think through how pressure is misread, absorbed, and eventually allowed to escalate, and what young people should understand before crisis becomes inevitable. Abdulhaleem Ishaq Ringim is a Nigerian economist, public policy analyst, and governance advisor working at the intersection of economic reform, climate resilience, and institutional response. He currently serves as special assistant to the governor of Kaduna State on economic matters and as the Kaduna State coordinator for the African Union Development Agency, AUDA NEPAD, supporting subnational implementation of development and resilience initiatives. Welcome to the Delimi PROSPER Project, Abdulhaleem.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for having me.
Kaduna is a major cosmopolis, which is also known for its ethno-religious and resource-based conflict threat profiles. So, before we talk about economics and resilience, I would like to begin with familiar spaces. What was it like growing up in Kaduna in the 2000s and late 90s?
Well, thank you very much once again for having me. As I know you're already aware, Kaduna is a very large state, and I particularly grew up in Zaria. And for Zaria, the story was a bit different from other parts of Kaduna. My experience in Zaria was largely peaceful. Our environment was peaceful. People lived in harmony. Even despite the fact that this is my lived experience, it doesn't really take away the fact that other things were happening in other spaces in Kaduna State. We all know the crisis profiles and the trajectory from the 1987 crisis to the 1992 crisis and the 2000 Sharia crisis. Those days were really dark days for Kaduna State. For Zaria, like I said, it was largely peaceful. When you look at the profiles of the people living in Zaria, and I think that is why, and that is the reason why Zaria actually has this rather peaceful and harmonious profile. It is because Zaria has historically been accommodating. It has a history of accommodating diversity in all forms, be it in ethnicity, in religion, or in culture. We grew up in that space. I usually tell people that the very first agent of socialization, which is one of the most important agents of socialization, which is the school, the one that I particularly attended was owned by an Igbo pastor named Pastor Chikeze Nwabuko. And our teachers, 90% of them were not of my tribe or religion or culture. Most of them were from southern part of the country, and a number of them from other parts of Kaduna State. And that is how we grew up in Zaria. So my experience growing up, even though it was a period that is dark for our history, my particular experience was that of peace and harmonious coexistence.
Okay. Abdulhaleem, before insecurity becomes visible, social and other pressures would have already been building. From your experience inside government policy making and policy shaping circles, what kinds of early pressures worry you the most?
So I would start with peculiar pressures, especially ones that are peculiar to northern Nigeria, Kaduna, and other parts of the north. That would be educational exclusion. It is really a worrying situation where you have, for example, in Nigeria, you have about 18 million out of school children. And for northern Nigeria, I think it has been institutionalized in a form of way because we have the Almajiri system, which constitutes a majority of these numbers. This is really scary. The exclusion from educational institutions and a very important agent of socialization. It is really a scary trend that worries me, and that is one of the most fundamental signals for insecurity even before it erupts. Secondly, I would say economic stagnation or stagnation for as far as economic mobility is concerned. So economic mobility here simply means the enhancement or improvement of the economic status of citizens. But when we look at the situations critically, going back 1 or 2 decades, we realize that there's been a form of stagnation, and the causation is largely multifaceted. From our receptiveness to education, to how we talk about skills development, and generally to how we solve economic development problems. That is really worrying. It speaks to an increase in inequality, and it is really a time bomb that worries me also. And then perhaps thirdly would be, and this is very important for young people, rigidities in mindset, lack of flexibility in thought. How we have come to consider received or inherited perceptions of reality of history as things that are sacrosanct and cannot be subject to historical reviews and all that. And that raises a very, very serious alarm, because that means as young people we cannot sit down to have meaningful dialogue. We come to conversations that are supposed to be dialogues with rigid mindsets, with preconceived notions that are largely inflexible. It's a very serious issue, and one of the very signals to insecurity that really worries me. So basically, if I could talk about 3 of these things, I would say these are basically the ones that worry me the most.
Okay. So you've worked across economic reform, agriculture, and emergency response. When do institutions usually notice stress, and why is it so often too late?
Well, I would say institutions do not really notice stress. They only notice things happening when these things metamorphose into full-blown crisis. And I think it has to do with the nature of institutional setup and cultures of our institutions, especially here in Nigeria. We do not look at signals, early warnings. We do not have early warning systems that are really effective. We consider, these signals as standalone signals. We do not have a system of making these signals into patterns and understanding the trajectories and using the data available to us at every point in time to really deploy them for foresight analysis, to look at the implication of the data at hand for the future of whatever society we are talking about. So these institutions, like I said, are mostly reactive rather than preventive. And, they do not foster resilience at the end of the day, because they are not able to really understand and develop the path from the data they have to the implication of that data. for the future. I mean, a clear example is the trajectory of banditry in northern Nigeria, particularly the northwest. It is simply an issue that started as conflict or clashes, yes, clashes here and there between farmers and herders, occasioned by certain climate issues, resource competition, water, land, and all that. Again, from farmer herder clashes, it started to metamorphose into something else. At some point in time, we didn't even know how to characterize both ends of the crisis. When the whole self-defense thing started happening, there were the Mbindiga and the Insecurity and all that. And our characterizations of both of them were that they were bandits. So the Mbindiga were bandits, the Insecurity were bandits. And then it created an atmosphere that attracted a third force that, had no inclination towards any culture and had no real grievance. It was just a criminal enterprise for them. So it became an opportunistic venture, and that attracted these, what I like to call the third force, basically commercialized the entire criminal operation. And fast forward, we have what we have today, full-blown banditry that could even be described as terrorism. It's quite unfortunate. The signals were there early on, but we didn't consider them actionable enough. And we therefore didn't prepare for the implication of those signals for the future. So this is basically how I think our institutions work and why they are not able to detect signals from the early onset until they become full-blown crises.
Climate stress. So climate stress particularly first shows up in livelihoods, a harvest loss this year, increase in food prices, and of course migration. So why are these rarely treated as security signals until they become full-blown conflicts and internal security challenges?
I think this question is also related to the previous question, and the response would largely be the same. But here's a way to think about it, and this is how I've seen developed countries, would I say, or developed climes do it. We don't look at resilience in compartmentalized formats. We look at resilience as a holistic concept. So when you're talking about resilience or prevention of insecurity or crisis, you look at the possible factors that can feed into these crises from a holistic point of view. So you compartmentalize at first, but then you have to have a system that really brings them together to give you a trend that would really give you the opportunity of understanding the implications of this for the future. How I've seen this particular issue resolved to a certain extent is having what they call offices of resilience. So these offices of resilience are basically coordinating offices that assess shocks and stresses in their short, medium, and long-term manifestations, and try as much as possible to bring them together. So you're talking about climate shocks, you're talking about environmental shocks, you're talking about economic shocks, you're talking about historic shocks, like we've talked about the history of Kaduna and the crisis that define it. You talk about social shocks. At first, you'd see that these shocks are compartmentalized, these stresses are compartmentalized. But when you deploy it into a system that brings them together, and try to assess them and create pathways or create trajectories that lead to understanding of the implications of these shocks and stresses for the future, you'd see that you are able to build resilience strategies that cut across all of these compartmentalized components. And at the end of the day, you have holistic strategies that seek to solve the problem from a holistic point of view, rather than assessing them and dealing with them, as in compartmentalized formats.
Okay. So you've been involved in responses to agricultural shocks and environmental stress. So I'm going to take back on what you've just said. What happens when these are framed as temporary problems rather than structural risks? And how should we go about, more importantly, how should we go about assigning the correct risk assessment to these issues?
Well, when we continue to frame them as temporary shocks, they naturally beget temporary solutions. So instead of us to look at it as structural problems, we look at them as cyclical problems. And then the simple possible solutions we assign to them are solutions that are for immediate stabilization instead of long-term structural reform. And that is the problem. And the major reason, I would say, is the fact that we do not have effective early warning systems that are able to aggregate these signals. And the institutional culture does not favor resilience, the enhancement and entrenchment of resilience from a holistic point of view, like we mentioned before. So we continue to treat them as temporary shocks, and we, by extension, continue to treat them as shocks that are compartmentalized instead of shocks that can actually be aligned to talk about something for the future. The moment we can work on our early warning systems and we can really have a paradigm shift in the way that institutional cultures and traditions are framed, from that reactive culture to the preventive resilience building culture, that is when we'll be able to assign to these shocks, the very effective, numerical assessment or whatever, or however we want to do the assessment. That is how we'll be able to do that, and that is how that would feed into, developing resilience strategies that would have solutions that cut across all of these components that we've talked about.
Let's speak on early warning systems, particularly in multi-ethnic, multi-religious, cosmopolitan spaces such as the ones that we have in Nigeria and northern Nigeria. One of the main issues is, of course, building the early warning systems in these sorts of challenging areas, but also the thing about trust, So how could you speak about building more effective, let's say the early warning systems for the next 5 years, for the next 10 years? What would those building blocks be that would ensure trust and interoperability?
I think we would have to now speak to communication between the various components that are responsible for entrenching these early warning systems. Of course, early warning systems can never be effective if they are not entrenched in a community-based format. And if they are entrenched in a community-based format, you'd also have to develop a strategy where the communities have direct access to the government and the government are open to feedbacks from the communities. The moment you are able to develop this sort of community-based early warning systems, I think you'd be good to go. A case study here would be the Kaduna Peace Model that is currently being implemented by the administration of His Excellency Malam Basani. We've talked about the crisis profiles of Kaduna State and the factors, both remote and roots are there. But when he came, he realized that we must entrench whatever solution that we think would be effective towards solving these problems in the communities. So we basically, the administration basically started to build trust. How do you build trust? You entrench justice. You engender inclusion. The moment you are able to do that, everybody feels at ease and, decide that, okay, there's now a reason for me to trust this government. And at the end of the day, the communities now become open to giving feedbacks, become open to mobilizing themselves into community watches, open to mobilizing intelligence, community-based intelligence, and these are the various components that actually build up an effective early warning system. So, of course, you have to talk about entrenching justice, inclusion, which automatically starts to build trust, and then it goes full swing. Communication is there, the channels are open. the trust is there, and the political will is there. The moment you have these factors, I think you would be on the path to creating a very effective early warning system.
Thank you very much. So Zaria has absorbed enormous economic and social pressures for the last 300 to 500 years without collapsing in the way some other places have. What explains this?
Okay. So compared to other communities or societies, Zaria has really been resilient even in the face of the most daring crisis factors. But I think what explains this is what they call small area variations, where you would see communities often with the same profiles, the same descriptions, having different ways of responding to shocks and stresses. And I've come to understand that the explanation for these small area variations is what they call the overstory. So there's definitely an overstory that explains how Zaria is able to absorb these shocks and stresses the way it can. And I think one of the very important overstories has to do with the history of Zaria as a very accommodating society. Even from the urban formation of Zaria, you would know that it is very receptive to diversity. You have the Zaria city that is predominantly inhabited by, indigenous Zaria people to a certain extent. You have the Tudunwada and the Waje aspect of Zaria, which are basically societies that accommodate anybody coming from across the northern part of Nigeria.
Yeah.
And then you have Sabangari, which houses, all the other ethnic groups from, southern Nigeria and all that. So this very urban makeup or formation basically positioned Zaria as one society or one city that is receptive and accommodative to diversity. But then institutions further institutionalized this, reception to diversity. So Zaria is, let's talk about the most important and perhaps the oldest institutions, the Emirates, the Emirate Council, which has been very instrumental ab initio in entrenching this culture of reception. It also had its own sort of early warning system, its own sort of redress and reconciliation mechanisms, conflict resolution mechanisms, and all that are embedded in a hierarchy that is community-based. So from the community itself to the larger society, to the emirate itself. And then further, closer in history, you have institutions, educational institutions like ABU, for example, which is situated in Zaria and happens to be the most cosmopolitan university in Nigeria, where you hardly have a class that do not have a student that is from any of each of the 36 states of Nigeria and FCT. So that further institutionalized, how Zaria, receive and handles diversity. Like I said, for me, growing up in Zaria, it was like this, and diversity was all over. So this is the experience that I have, and I think it's one of the issues that really sets Zaria apart and really explains how Zaria is able to absorb these shocks and stresses that other communities might not be able to. And also you have to talk about the various means of livelihood in Zaria. So you have a very booming trade culture in Zaria. You have the skills and craft culture. You have the education culture. And I think one very important factor that I missed is the fact that the Emirate system basically ran Islamic Sharia. And at the very core of Islamic teaching, at the very core of the teachings of Islam is peaceful coexistence, peaceful and harmonious coexistence. So these institutions were able to really implement and interpret these teachings as they are supposed to be. And that is why, for, like you said, 300 years, 500 years, the implementation of these teachings, as they are supposed to be, have contributed enormously in building a very cosmopolitan, a very peaceful, and a very harmonious Zaire.
So if we stopped looking for weapons and burning huts and started looking instead for warning signals, what do you think we'd see first? And more importantly, how can young people work with government to address these things?
So the moment we're able to start thinking in that line, we would see signals as the signals that they are, and not things that we easily overlook or easily dismiss. And the moment we start to see signals this way, we begin to draw up patterns, and we begin to understand the imperative of putting these patterns into work, into analysis, to help us understand what the perhaps future implications of these patterns will be. The moment we're able to do that, we are practically shifting from the previous ways we handle actionable signals, and we are setting the path towards, resilience, as it were. For young people, I think it's very important that we understand that security or resilience is as much the responsibility of the government as it is our responsibility. The cliche, leaders of tomorrow, but we're actually leaders of today. If you look at the demographic idiosyncrasy of Nigeria, you'd realize that the young people are basically the people.
Yeah.
Remove young people from Nigeria's population and you'd have a very insignificant number. So we have to realize that it is as much our responsibility to entrench security, to entrench resilience. And we can only do that if we learn from the mistakes of the past. So this is another cliche. They say experience is the best teacher. But I have a teacher who usually says that this statement is incomplete because it becomes very, very expensive when you have to learn from your own experience all the time. So you have to learn from other people's experiences. And you learn these experiences from histories, from cultures, from learning from people around that are more experienced than you, from books. And the moment you're able to do that, you'd start to understand patterns. They repeat themselves, even if not in the same way. And you're able to learn from these patterns, learn from these mistakes, and try as much as possible, if you're able to approach it with open mind, be able to not toe that path again. And the moment we're able to do that, I think we are good to go. So for young people, I think we have to be open-minded. We have to also be very inquisitive, and we have to be responsible because, like I said, the resilience of a society, the security of a society, the development of a society is as much responsibility of a government as it is our responsibility as young people.
So I'm going to take you up still on the last question on young people. You work inside institutions but belong to a much younger generation. What do young people misunderstand the most about how institutions function, particularly in moments of stress?
Well, in moments of stress or not, I think there's a general lack of appreciation of institutional procedure and processes. So, because we do not pay attention to these things, we feel that the moment an issue erupts, there should be instantaneous responses. We do not think about the procedures, the processes, the budgetary space. It would interest you to know that there are young people that feel the moment the budget, an amount is announced for a budget, they feel that that amount has been set aside in an account. It's already there. It's just for you to draw down it. We don't pay close attention to understand that budgets are basically estimates of what you think you would get over the year, the entire year, and how you think you would expend the resources you've mobilized across the year. So it's accumulation of what you get for January, February, March up to December, and you now, try as much as possible to see how to expend it in a very cost-effective way that you can. But most of us don't pay attention to these kinds of things, and therefore we become frustrated when we don't get the responses that we think we should from institutions, and perhaps these responses do not come as fast or as early as we want as we want them to come because of these procedures. So I think it's very important to work on our enlightenment of these kinds of things, of institutional procedures, of institutional processes, and also learn to engage these institutions in a very objective way. The moment you're able to do that, you create a communication link, and then you are able to really understand what happens within these institutions.
Abdulhaleem, related to the last question, where do institutions most often misunderstand young people when pressure is building?
That is another very important question. I feel institutions, considering their makeup, these institutions, you go in there and you see that the people occupying these institutions are really mid-aged or old and people. So there's this factor of ageism that, happens where they simply feel that young people do not necessarily have any experience or exposure to be able to feed into, policy making. They simply do not have the knowledge, nor have they amassed any experience to be able to serve as advisors or counterparts in public policy making. That is a very important issue that most young people face in those kinds of institutions or settings. I particularly was definitely a victim of that, although it has come to pass. And then there's this disturbing tendency of also being dismissive on the basis of certain labels. So somebody would simply sit down in his chair and say, that young person does not know what he's saying. He's just a Gen Z who complains a lot. And those complaints actually could serve as signals. So I think these are some of the issues that really keep institutions and young people apart. Institutions really need to become more receptive to young people, to understand their way of thinking. Of course, we have evolved in some way, but it also behoves on us to understand the process of that evolution and how to understand, the factors that have led to that evolution and the outputs of that evolution. Of course, there's the Gen Z thing, but then beneath the Gen Z thing are also signals that should not be dismissed by institutions, especially when we are talking about crisis management, we're talking about resilience, and we're talking about early warning systems.
So as a development economist, if you could change one thing about how Nigeria responds to environmental and livelihood stress, what would it be and why that thing?
So it would be that I would engender paradigm shifts in institutional cultures from the reactive culture that it currently operates within to a more preventive and resilient, proactive and resilience building culture that it should be operating within. So let's talk about signals as signals. Let's try to understand signals when they are signals. Let's try to build patterns for these signals. Let's try to consider these signals as inputs into a system that analyzes these signals and give us some tentative idea of what the future implications of these signals are, and let us be able to build up early warning systems, that feed off these signals. Let us start to, be more coordinated in as against how we approach things these days as compartmentalized issues. So let's look at shocks and stresses as they are compartmentalized, but let's have a system that really aligns and harmonize these stresses and shocks in a way that it could give us actionable insights into what we should be able to do to prevent certain issues that might impede resilience or might impede the free flow of security or peace or harmony. I think the problem is in the culture, and the moment we're able to address this culture to a more proactive resilience building, coordinated culture for institutions that have one inclination or the other to resilience building would start to do well, I think.
So this is from your current perspective, from your current place, as a mid-level, you hold a mid-level policy shaping role, closely related to the previous question, the balance between signal and noise. From that key place, how do you balance between what is actually a signal and what is noise, particularly when you've got information coming from so many places?
Well, unfortunately, it's a hard one, because you could say that all noises are not signals, but some signals can be pinpointed from noises. So I think you would have to, as much as possible, consider all of it. And that is why you really need to build systems that are able to consider all of them, and then are also able to filter out the signals from the noise. I think the moment you are able to do that, you'd find out that the more the noise, the more the understanding of the signals that may be inherent in those noises. And the more you're able to build patterns out of those insights, and also you're able to build, you're able to do foresight analysis, and you're able to build resilience systems out of these inputs. So it's really a hard one to be able to distinguish signals from noises, but that is why you need to consider all of it. You cannot do that if you don't have institutions that are really optimally equipped in design and mandate to be able to foster resilience building in communities. The moment you are able to legislate for the constitution of these systems, of these institutions, I think it becomes easy to really absorb all the noise, but at the same time have filters that filter out signals from them.
Okay. That's lovely. So for young people listening today, what is the single habit or lens or framework, however you want to call it, that they should develop in order to recognize danger early without resorting to panic or cynicism or even adopting rigid understandings of these things?
So we are at both ends of a spectrum here, panic and cynicism. So with panic, you basically exaggerate every signal. With cynicism, you basically dismiss all of it. I think the idea is to be at the middle and just be attentive. In attentiveness, try as much as possible to understand the workings of the systems that you are operating within. Try as much as possible to be open-minded in a way that you are receptive to as much information as possible. Try as much as possible to also build capacity for communication with the government in an objective way. We tend to feel that the only way to approach issues that has to do with institutions or government is to be confrontational. But I find it that the most effective way is basically to objectively engage these governments, to hold them accountable because they are there because of your mandate. The moment you are able to do that, you'll be simply ratifying the social contract. We're holding you accountable. We've noticed this, and we expect you to do that. Of course, within the bandwidth of the information we have. Of course, it's left for the institutions to also combine with the information they have and do the needful. So the idea is to be open-minded. I've talked about preconceived notions. I've talked about rigidities in mindsets. I've talked about inherited assumptions or grievances. I think with open-mindedness, we'll be able to really approach these issues with a very objective mind. We'll be able to understand the issues through dialogue, and we'll be able to, as I said before, learn from the mistakes of the past and, build a future that is not in the past. And we also need to adopt what Nassim Nicholas Taleb calls intellectual humility. So let us not feel as though we know everything, because in the grand scheme of things, we basically do not know nothing. So let us try as much as possible to be intellectually humble, open-minded to ideas and critical in thought. so as we do not become pawns in the very prevalent, manipulative tendencies that have become the order of the day. So, yeah.
Born and raised largely in Zaria, Abdulhaleem brings a grounded understanding of how economic pressure, environmental stress, and institutional responses are experienced long before they are framed as security problems. He has been directly involved in policies addressing financial inclusion, MSME development, agricultural resilience, emergency response, and climate-smart livelihoods, giving him a hands-on exposure to how everyday pressures quietly accumulate. Beyond government, he is an award-winning public affairs writer with work across major Nigerian outlets, examining governance failure, insecurity, and policy miscommunication. A first-class economics graduate of Ahmadu Bello University, he represents a generation of young policy actors operating inside institutions while remaining fluent in public narrative and youth realities.